Hi, so this is the second video for week 4, and in this video we're going to talk about something that scholars call the gap, and we're going to talk about how to fill that gap. So I've talked before about how the research that you do fits into a conversation where you're building on each other's ideas, and researchers often use this metaphor. So when they look at the research that's already been done and they're reading what other people have done, they're thinking to themselves, what information is missing from this puzzle? Or from this picture. And that missing information is the gap. And you'll hear this term, the gap, sometimes. It's not one that I'm using uniquely. So for this video, I want you to think, instead of the conversation, think of it as a massive puzzle. And each piece of knowledge that we come up with is one more thing that we can add into that puzzle. But remember how when you're doing a puzzle, one of the things you do is you look at patterns in the puzzle. So if I'm doing a puzzle with my friends and family, for instance, I might look at an area on a puzzle where I'm like, okay, so in this section, there's like little blue flowers and there's a red line going through it, and there's a nub going out on one side and a nub going in on the other. And I know there's words for those things, but I'm not that good at puzzles. So I'm able to describe the piece I'm looking for by understanding the things that are already around that hole. So when we ask questions to create research, we're able to understand what it is that will fill that hole if we can describe the hole, that is the gap. So when we establish the beginning of our research project, one of the things we have to do is establish why that research is needed. And the way we do that is by defining the gap. And so we create this rhetorically by arguing that existing research has somehow overlooked, ignored, or opened up some problem. And so there's this template that most writers use some version of to introduce their research, which is basically a lot has been said about X, but not much has been said about Y. And Y is the gap. And so then they go on to say, this paper will seek to explore Y in the context of X by such and such method. And so what you're doing is you're acknowledging all the other puzzle pieces around it and how they point to your puzzle piece. So the way to fill the gap is primarily to pay attention to what other researchers are talking about in the general field you're interested in. So you have to pay attention to what's being said. This doesn't necessarily require you to be an expert. It just requires you to start listening to patterns. And then you establish the area that you want to cover. So if I'm working on a jigsaw puzzle and I've dumped out all the pieces and stuff, I'm not just going to pick up a piece and be like, I wonder where this goes, and just magically the puzzle starts working together. I have to have some kind of a strategy. And one of the strategies that's very common is by saying, okay, I'm going to start on the borders because I know what a border piece would look like. And then you say, okay, well, I look at the picture and I'm going to start on this distinctive feature here, so on. So you identify strategies for the specific area that you're working on filling gaps in. And so it should be as narrow as you can practically make it. People think, well, I need to cover a broad space to have lots to talk about. But it's actually the opposite. The smaller your space, the more you have to talk about it, because the deeper you can get into it. So if you imagine it like a piece of clay, you only have so much clay, which is the amount of paper that you have to talk about, or that you have to write in. But if you roll the clay very thin and flat, it'll cover a lot of surface area, but it won't be very strong and it won't be very deep, and you can't really do much with it other than just cover a large area. But if you make it into like a ball or a cylinder or something deep, then it covers a surface area, but it's stronger and you can do a lot of other things with it. So when you're writing, you want to make sure that you narrow your topic as much as is practically possible. Another thing you can do to find a gap is apply a specific method to a new idea that you haven't seen that method used on before. Or you might try adding something. So you see people using a particular method on, maybe you've seen studies on, prison populations and this population, that population, and you're like, well, what about my community? Has my community been studied? And so you can actually add to the conversation that way. There's also another way where you consider the ways to respond. So a lot of time research is a response to someone else's work already. And when we respond, there's really only 3 ways we can respond, which is to say, yes, and I have more evidence for that. No, because I have this other evidence and that doesn't work. Or maybe, or yes, but, where you say, there's some good points here, but have you considered this other part of it which complicates what you're saying? So there's only really those 3 basic ways to respond, and the third is a really common way to respond. So don't feel like you have to either accept or reject everything. That's absolutely not the case. And of course, research always starts with observations. This might be an observation about the phenomenon you want to study, or it might be an observation about the research existing in the field you're studying in. So I have 2 examples from my own undergraduate experience of ways you can find a gap and fill it. So when I started studying video games, I was taking a class on fantasy literature. And I started with the observation of, so there's all these conventions and themes and stuff that we've been studying fantasy literature, and we've been looking at it in written literature and in film, but I can see these things also in the video games I like to play. So why isn't that being covered? And so this is a case of observing existing research and finding a gap in it, saying, okay, so this research is already covering this area, but there's this adjacent area that it hasn't covered yet, so I can cover that area. And so I was able to propose the project and say, okay, I want to take all these things we talked about in class that are already established and apply them to this newer media, that is the video games, that hasn't been studied yet, and see if it still applies. But then after that class, I proposed an independent study on video games because I was like, you know what, this is amazing. It's a new field. It's fascinating. There's so much to explore. I want to keep doing this. But in this case, I was making an observation about the world around me and wondering if the research could cover what I was seeing in the world around me. And so I looked around me, and as a woman who enjoys playing video games, I had seen many people talking about how women are not included in game communities or in game design. And I thought about this and I was like, wait a second, but I'm a girl who likes gaming. I know a lot of other women who like to play games, and a lot of the games I like to play are designed by women. So, why are we saying this? And so this was an observation of my experience not matching what I was seeing. And so the gap I was trying to fill is, okay, so why aren't we talking about these spaces where there are women playing games written by women? So I wound up doing this study and trying to fill this gap. The interesting thing about this case is that my initial hypothesis of these expecting that these games by women would themselves be more inclusive to women as players turned out to be wrong. And it actually was a really cool research experience because I had to constantly be revising my thesis because the data just wasn't matching it. I was finding that even though these women were really rock stars at the time in the game industry, their games were still using a lot of the same sexist tropes that I was seeing the research on sexism in video games complaining about. And so the real moral of that story is, absolutely use your experience, use your observations about the world, but also be open to changing your hypotheses, to realizing that maybe your own wishful thinking is coloring your hypothesis, or maybe your observations are incomplete, and be open to the fun of being wrong. And I know that sounds weird, but that's really what research is about, is correcting ourselves by finding more data to help ourselves. So I'm sorry that this is a longer video. I'll try to keep it short in the future, but anyway, so that's what I have for filling the gap. So that's something that's going to come up a lot in your abstract, and especially when you start writing your introduction for your research paper.